The Hittites stood face to face with pharaohs, ruled 1,000 gods, and fought battles that shook the ancient world. Yet in the end, they disappeared without a trace, until modern explorers uncovered their forgotten voice. Welcome back to the story of the Hittites. In this second part, we enter the golden age of their empire, their triumphs in diplomacy, and war, their legendary clash with Ramses II at Kadesh, and their dominance across Anatolia and Syria. But with every rise comes decline. We will follow their empire into its final struggles, its sudden collapse, and finally, the astonishing rediscovery of their lost history after 2,000 years of silence. When archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Hattusa, they did not only rediscover kings, armies, and treaties. They also uncovered glimpses of ordinary life. The empire may have risen and fallen with the power of its rulers, but it was sustained by the daily rhythms of its people: farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and scribes. To step into the world of the Hittites is to see how a Bronze Age society truly lived, how they built their homes, what they ate, how they worked, and how they worshipped. The heart of the Hittite world was the city. Hattusa itself was a sprawling capital, with massive walls encircling palaces, temples, and neighborhoods. But beyond the grandeur, most Hittites lived in modest houses built of mud brick on stone foundations. The houses were usually 2 stories. The lower floor stored food, tools, and livestock, while the upper floor served as the living space. Roofs were flat, made of wooden beams covered in clay. Windows were small, designed to keep out the wind and the chill of Anatolian winters. Inside, the rooms were simple. A central hearth provided warmth and a place to cook. Furniture was minimal: stools, low tables, reed mats, and wooden chests. Yet these homes were the backdrop for family life, laughter, and the quiet routines of survival. Most Hittites were farmers. The empire depended on the harvest of wheat, barley, and lentils grown in the central Anatolian plateau. Oxen pulled wooden plows through the soil. Sickles of bronze cut the grain at harvest time. Sheep, goats, and cattle were raised for milk, wool, and meat. Horses, prized for chariots, were carefully bred and trained. Hittite tablets even include instructions for horse training, detailed manuals that show how much care and science went into raising these animals. Seasonal festivals celebrated the cycles of planting and harvest. To the Hittites, farming was not only work but also a sacred act, bound to the favor of the gods. The Hittite diet was hearty and practical. Bread was the staple, baked from barley or wheat, sometimes flavored with sesame or honey. Beer, brewed from barley, was the common drink, though wine was also produced, especially in the southern regions. Vegetables such as onions, garlic, cucumbers, and beans flavored meals. Meat, while less common for ordinary people, was eaten during feasts or sacrifices: lamb, goat, beef, and even pork. Archaeological finds reveal clay ovens and grinding stones, silent witnesses to daily cooking. At royal banquets, the fare was more lavish. Records describe elaborate feasts where envoys from foreign lands were treated to roasted meats, wine, and sweet pastries. The king's table was both a display of hospitality and of power. His clothing reflected both climate and status. Ordinary men wore tunics made of wool or linen, belted at the waist with cloaks for warmth. Women wore long dresses with shawls or veils. Shoes were made of leather, tied with straps. The elite displayed their rank through richer fabrics, colorful dyes, and jewelry of gold, silver, and semi-precious stones. Seals carved from precious materials marked ownership and authority. Hittite art shows men with beards and hair tied back, while women wore their hair long, often braided. Personal grooming was valued. Combs, mirrors, and cosmetic containers have been found in excavations. The family formed the foundation of Hittite society. Marriage was formalized through agreements that included dowries and property rights. Women could own land and engage in business, and queens often held political influence alongside kings. Children were raised within extended households, learning farming, craftwork, or administration depending on their family's position. Boys might be trained as soldiers or scribes, while girls were taught weaving, cooking, and household management. The society was hierarchical. At the top stood the king, called the Great King, followed by nobles, priests, soldiers, and scribes. Below them were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. Slavery existed, often as a result of war, but slaves could sometimes earn freedom and integrate into society. The Hittites were skilled craftsmen. They worked in bronze, gold, and silver, producing weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects. Pottery was decorated with geometric designs used for storing grain, wine, and oil. One of their most remarkable achievements was ironworking. Though still rare, the Hittites were among the earliest people to smelt and forge iron, a technology that gave them an advantage in tools and weapons. Trade connected the Hittite world with distant lands. Caravans carried textiles, metals, and horses to Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. In return, the Hittites received luxury goods such as ivory, glass, and cedar wood. Military service was an important part of Hittite life. Every able man could be called upon to serve in the army, though the elite chariot warriors formed the backbone of Hittite power. Chariots, pulled by strong Anatolian horses, were both a weapon of war and a symbol of prestige. Training manuals detailed how to harness horses, how to drive the chariot, and how to coordinate with archers. Ordinary soldiers carried spears, shields, and swords of bronze or iron. The Hittite army was organized and disciplined, capable of waging campaigns across vast distances. Religion was not confined to temples, it was woven into daily life. Before meals, families offered prayers. Farmers invoked the storm god for rain. Travelers carried amulets for protection. Festivals marked the changing of seasons, blending the cycles of nature with the worship of divine powers. Even in ordinary homes, small clay figurines of deities have been found, evidence that the gods were never far from the Hittite hearth. The human side of an empire. Through these glimpses, homes of mud brick, loaves of bread, carved combs, and clay figurines, we see the Hittites not only as rulers of an empire, but as people. They laughed, worried, celebrated, and mourned. They faced harsh winters, worked the land, and prayed for good harvests. Their world was one of balance, between the power of the state and the simplicity of home, between the grandeur of the capital and the quiet strength of farmers. The rediscovery of their daily life reminds us that history is not only about kings and battles. It is also about the countless ordinary lives that together built the foundations of a civilization. Standing among the ruins of Hattusa today, it is easy to imagine the bustle of streets, the smell of baking bread, the bleating of goats, and the sound of children playing in courtyards. The stones whisper not only of empires but of families, of people who loved and lived, and in this way the Hittites step out of the shadows of history, not only as warriors and rulers but as human beings, very much like us. If there was one constant in Hittite life, it was the presence of the gods. For the Hittites, the divine world and the human world were not separate but deeply intertwined. Every act, whether planting crops, going to war, or signing a treaty, was carried out with the gods as witnesses. To understand the Hittites, we must understand their faith, a religion of storm and sun, of countless deities, and of rituals that bound heaven and earth together. The Hittites called their land the land of 1,000 gods. This phrase was not mere poetry. It reflected their extraordinary openness to the divine. Unlike some civilizations that worshipped a tightly defined pantheon, the Hittites absorbed gods from every people they encountered. From Anatolia came the storm, god Tarhuna, and the sun goddess Arina. From Mesopotamia they borrowed Ishtar, goddess of love and war. From Syria, they welcomed Baal, the stormbringer. Each city and village had its own local gods, and the Hittites rarely rejected any deity. Instead, they added new gods to their growing family of divine powers. This inclusive faith gave their religion a richness, but also a complexity. Temples were filled with statues and shrines to dozens of gods. Festivals honored one god after another, ensuring none felt neglected. At the heart of the Hittite religion was the sun goddess of Erinna, patron of the royal family. She was not only a goddess of light, but also of justice and order. Kings swore oaths in her name. Treaties invoked her as witness, and queens often served as her chief priestesses. Her worship took place in Erinna, a city sacred to the Hittites, though her presence was also honored in Hattusa. To the people, she was a source of warmth and life, much like the Egyptian sun god Ra, but with a distinctly Anatolian character of nurturing and protection. Alongside her stood the storm god, known as Tarhuna, or simply the storm god of Hatti. He controlled rain, thunder, and fertility, making him vital to the survival of the agricultural society. But he was not just a giver of life. He was also a warrior god, battling against forces of chaos, serpents, monsters, and rebellious spirits. In myths, he often struggled but eventually triumphed, a reflection of the Hittites' own worldview, that order had to be constantly defended against disorder. One of the most famous Hittite myths tells of the storm god's battle with the serpent Iluyanka. In one version, the serpent defeats the god, stealing his heart and eyes. Only with the help of a mortal ally does the storm god regain his strength and defeat the serpent. This story is more than a tale of monsters. It symbolizes the eternal struggle between chaos and order, darkness and light, winter and spring. Each year, as crops withered in the cold and returned with the rains, the people retold the myth, seeing their lives mirrored in the fate of their gods. Temples were the beating heart of Hittite cities. Built of stone with courtyards and inner sanctuaries, they housed the statues of the gods. Priests and priestesses tended to these statues as if the gods themselves were physically present. Daily rituals included offerings of bread, beer, meat, and incense. Musicians played flutes and drums, while dancers performed sacred movements. During major festivals, entire cities participated in processions, carrying statues of the gods through the streets so that they might bless the people and the land. One of the greatest ritual sites was Yazilikaya, a sanctuary carved into rock near Hattusa. There, processions of gods and goddesses were carved in stone, immortalizing the Hittite pantheon. Even today, the reliefs of deities marching across the rock face give a sense of timeless reverence. Religion was not separate from politics. The Hittite king was both ruler and high priest, responsible for maintaining harmony between humans and gods. His authority was not absolute. It depended on the god's favor. A failed harvest or military defeat could be interpreted as divine anger, and the king had to perform rituals to restore balance. Queens played a central role as well. Queen Puduhepa, for example, was both a political figure and a religious leader, overseeing temple administration and promoting the worship of the sun goddess. Her prayers, preserved on clay tablets, reveal a personal and intimate relationship with the divine, blending official ritual with heartfelt devotion. The Hittites believed that oaths carried divine weight. When two kings signed a treaty, they swore by the gods to uphold it. To break an oath was not just a political betrayal, but a religious crime that invited the wrath of heaven. This gave Hittite diplomacy its moral force. The gods themselves were guarantors of peace, and the fear of divine punishment acted as a deterrent to treachery. In this way, religion shaped not only personal life but also international relations. Beyond the grand temples and royal rituals, ordinary Hittites also practiced religion in small, personal ways. Amulets protected children from illness. Spells and incantations were recited against snake bites or nightmares. Farmers offered the first sheaves of grain to the gods, hoping for a good harvest. Divination was common. Priests examined the livers of sacrificed animals, interpreted the flight of birds, or read omens in dreams. To the Hittites, the gods were constantly speaking, and it was the duty of humans to listen. The Hittite religion was not about one god or one story, but about weaving together many traditions into a shared identity. In adopting foreign gods and preserving local ones, the Hittites created a spiritual mosaic that mirrored their empire itself, diverse, adaptable, and united by a sense of sacred order. Though their temples have crumbled and their prayers are fragments on clay, their faith still echoes. It tells us that the Hittites lived in a world alive with divine presence, where every storm, sunrise, and harvest carried the fingerprints of the gods. Today, the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya still stands under the open sky. The gods carved into its walls march in silent procession, as if waiting for the rituals to resume. Their faces remind us of a people who believed that the divine was never far away. For the Hittites, to live was to walk in the company of gods, and through their myths and sanctuaries, we can still walk beside them. Every civilization must find a way to live together. Cities cannot thrive if theft goes unpunished, if disputes cannot be settled, or if violence tears apart communities. The Hittites, like their Mesopotamian and Egyptian neighbors, understood this truth. They built not only armies and temples but also a system of law, rules written down to bring order, fairness, and stability to their growing empire. When we study the Hittite laws, we see something remarkable: a society practical in spirit, humane in many judgments, and surprisingly modern in its attempt to balance justice with mercy. Hittite laws survive not in stone monuments, but on clay tablets. Dozens of these tablets, discovered in the royal archives of Hattusa, contain hundreds of laws covering everything from property disputes to marriage, from theft to witchcraft. Unlike the famous Code of Hammurabi, carved in basalt to display the king's authority, the Hittite laws seem intended as a practical guide for judges, scribes, and governors. They were tools for daily life rather than symbols of royal power. The language is straightforward, almost conversational. A law might begin, "If anyone steals a sheep," or "If a man strikes another." The style suggests a focus not on lofty principle but on real problems that ordinary people faced. What stands out most in the Hittite legal system is its relative leniency. Many Mesopotamian laws demanded execution for theft, adultery, or disobedience. The Hittites, by contrast, often preferred fines, compensation, or restitution. For example, if someone stole an ox, the penalty was usually to repay the owner with more cattle rather than face death. If a house was accidentally burned, the responsible person had to rebuild it, not lose their life. This does not mean the Hittites were soft. They punished crimes firmly, but their laws reveal a society that valued restoration over vengeance. Justice was about repairing harm, not only exacting punishment. Family life was carefully regulated. Marriages were legal contracts, often arranged between families. Dowries and bride prices were recorded, ensuring clarity if disputes arose. The Hittite laws also recognized the rights of women in ways unusual for the ancient world. Women could own property, initiate divorce in some cases, and were protected against certain abuses. If a husband mistreated his wife, she could return to her family without penalty. Still, the system remained patriarchal. Men held more rights than women, and social class influenced how the law was applied. Yet, compared to some of their neighbors, the Hittites allowed women a larger role in society and law. Like most ancient peoples, the Hittites practiced slavery. But again, their approach was distinctive. Slaves could own property, marry freely, and even buy their freedom. In some cases, if a master mistreated a slave, the law required the slave to be released. There was also a path to social mobility. Captives from war might begin as slaves but could rise to positions of influence if they earned trust. In this sense, slavery in the Hittite world was harsh but not always permanent or absolute. The Hittite laws punished violence but often with compensation rather than death. If a man injured another, he paid a fine in silver or livestock. Even cases of manslaughter were sometimes resolved by payment to the victim's family. However, there were exceptions. Certain crimes, like witchcraft, treason, or major acts of rebellion, could bring execution. These offenses were seen not just as crimes against individuals, but as threats to the order of society and the will of the gods. In an empire built on farming, livestock, and trade, property law was essential. The Hittite codes carefully defined boundaries, inheritance rights, and ownership disputes. If a field was sold, the contract had to be witnessed and sealed. If an animal caused damage, the owner bore responsibility. Even disputes over trees or vineyards had set penalties. What emerges is a picture of a society where law was not abstract but rooted in the daily realities of rural and urban life. The Hittites believed the gods were guardians of justice. Oaths, contracts, and treaties were sworn before divine witnesses, and breaking them was both a legal crime and a spiritual sin. Priests sometimes played roles in trials, and divine oracles could be consulted to settle difficult cases. In this way, religion and law were deeply intertwined, ensuring that human justice reflected cosmic order. One fascinating feature of the Hittite laws is that they were not static. Over time, laws were revised, softened, or clarified. Scholars call this the Hittite Law Code. But in truth, it was more like a living document, a set of rules constantly adapted to new circumstances. For example, early versions of the laws included harsher penalties, but later revisions reduced them, replacing execution with fines or labor. This shows a society willing to learn, evolve, and improve its sense of fairness. For the Hittite Empire, law was more than a way to resolve disputes. It was the glue that held a diverse and sprawling realm together. From Anatolian villagers to Syrian merchants, people of many languages and customs lived under Hittite rule. The law provided a shared framework, a sense that order and justice could be expected no matter one's background. In this way, law was both practical and political. It helped maintain loyalty, reduce rebellion, and project the image of the king as not just a warrior, but also a judge. Though the Hittites disappeared as a great power, their laws left a legacy. The idea that justice should focus on compensation rather than sheer brutality influenced later legal traditions. Their balance of strictness and mercy feels strikingly modern, a reminder that even in the Bronze Age people sought fairness, not just fear. When we read their laws today, we hear echoes of a people who knew that civilization depended on more than armies and kings. It depended on rules written in clay, designed to guide human behavior with wisdom and restraint. The Hittite laws reveal a society practical, humane, and deeply aware of the fragility of order. They remind us that law is not only about punishment, it is about balance, restoration, and the pursuit of harmony in human life. In their courts and contracts, in their clay tablets and rulings, the Hittites left us not only a record of crimes and penalties, but a vision of what justice could mean. And in that vision, we find a bridge across the ages, from the fields of ancient Anatolia to the modern world, where the search for fairness continues. When we think of ancient empires, we often imagine battles, conquest, and the clash of armies. But alongside war, there was another tool just as powerful: diplomacy. And in this realm, the Hittites were pioneers. They were not only warriors of Anatolia, but also skilled negotiators, peacekeepers, and deal-makers who shaped the very idea of international relations. The Hittites taught the world that sometimes words can achieve what swords cannot. The Bronze Age was not a peaceful era. Great powers rose and competed across the eastern Mediterranean: Egypt along the Nile, Babylon in Mesopotamia, Mitanni in Syria, Assyria on the Tigris, and the Hittites in Anatolia. Each wanted land, trade, and influence. Yet these powers also realized they needed each other. Trade routes carried tin, copper, and luxury goods. Marriages joined royal families. Wars might rage, but too much bloodshed could destroy prosperity for all. It was in this tense and interconnected world that the Hittites mastered the art of diplomacy. The Hittites are credited with producing some of the earliest known international treaties in history. These were not vague promises but detailed agreements inscribed on clay tablets, witnessed by gods, and kept in royal archives. One famous example is the treaty between the Hittite king Suppiluliuma and the Mitanni kingdom. It carefully outlined terms of alliance, tribute, and mutual defense. It even named specific gods of both sides as guarantors of the pact, ensuring divine punishment if either broke it. This was not only law, it was international law, a new idea in a world where might often made right. The Hittites often turned to diplomacy when war was too costly. Sometimes they offered defeated kings the chance to remain on their thrones as loyal vassals, bound by treaty. In return, these rulers promised tribute, soldiers, and obedience. This approach created a network of client states stretching from Anatolia to northern Syria. Instead of endless conquest, the Hittites ruled through loyalty, oaths, and clever politics. They understood that control could be achieved not only with force but with trust, however fragile. Nowhere was Hittite diplomacy more famous than in their dealings with Egypt. For centuries, these two superpowers were rivals. Both sought control of Syria, where trade routes and fertile lands offered wealth and power. Their armies clashed in one of history's most legendary battles, the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE. Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II claimed victory, while Hittite king Muwatalli II likely saw the battle as a stalemate. Neither side could fully defeat the other, and so words had to finish what swords could not. Decades after Kadesh, the Hittites and Egyptians achieved something extraordinary, the first recorded peace treaty in history that survives to this day. Known as the Treaty of Kadesh, it was signed between Hittite king Hattusili III and Ramesses II of Egypt. The treaty promised peace and brotherhood forever. It declared that neither side would attack the other, and that they would come to each other's aid if attacked by a third power. It also included extradition clauses. Fugitives fleeing from one land to the other would be returned. Copies of the treaty exist in both Egypt and Hattusa, written in two languages, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. A replica even hangs on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York today, as a symbol of the world's oldest surviving peace agreement. Treaties were not the only tool. Royal marriages also sealed alliances. Hittite princesses were often married to neighboring rulers, binding kingdoms together through family ties. One famous case was the marriage between a Hittite princess and Pharaoh Ramesses II. After years of rivalry, this union symbolized a new era of friendship between two great empires. It was more than romance. It was strategy, a living contract embodied in flesh and blood. Hittite treaties were not dry legal documents. They were dramatic, sacred performances. When a treaty was made, oaths were sworn before gods, sacrifices were offered, and elaborate curses were read aloud. A typical oath might warn, "If you break this treaty, may the gods of heaven and earth destroy your land, your seed, and your house." These terrifying words ensured loyalty, for to betray an oath was to invite both divine wrath and political ruin. Thus, treaties were both political tools and religious ceremonies, binding men with fear of the supernatural. The Hittites left a blueprint for diplomacy that echoes through time. Their treaties contained elements we still recognize today: mutual defense pacts, extradition laws, recognition of sovereignty, and even clauses for succession disputes. They proved that even in an age of bronze weapons and walled cities, the pen could be as mighty as the sword. In fact, their survival as a great power often depended on it. Yet, for all their skill, diplomacy could not save the Hittites forever. As the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, waves of invasions, famine, and rebellion shattered the empire. Treaties crumbled, alliances dissolved, and once loyal vassals turned away. The great diplomats of Hattusa disappeared, leaving behind only the clay tablets of their words. But those words lived on, a reminder of how fragile yet powerful diplomacy can be. When we read the Hittite treaties today, we see the birth of a new idea, that nations could coexist not only through war, but through negotiation. In their careful oaths, in their shared promises, we glimpse the beginnings of international law, a concept that still shapes our world. The Hittites may be gone, but their diplomacy remains. Their treaties whisper across millennia, reminding us that peace, too, has a history. The dusty plains of Syria trembled with the sound of chariots. In the spring of 1274 BCE, two of the world's greatest superpowers collided near the fortress city of Kadesh, the Egyptian army of Pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite forces led by King Muwatalli II. It would become one of the most legendary battles of the ancient world, one remembered for its scale, its drama, and its surprising conclusion. Kadesh was no ordinary city. Sitting along the Orontes River, it controlled vital trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Whoever held Kadesh held the keys to power in Syria. For decades, Egypt and the Hittites fought for dominance in this region. Each time one gained the upper hand, the other returned to challenge it. By the reign of Ramesses II, the struggle had reached its climax. The young pharaoh, eager to prove his might, marched north to seize Kadesh once and for all. But waiting for him was a Hittite king who knew the art of patience and deception. Ramesses set out with a grand force. 4 divisions of infantry and chariots, each named after a god, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. His army stretched across the desert sands like a moving city, their banners flying in the wind, their bronze weapons glinting in the sun. Yet distance and heat slowed them. Ramesses, confident in his strength, pushed ahead with his leading division, leaving the others days behind. It was a mistake the Hittites were ready to exploit. Muwatalli II had gathered not only Hittite warriors but also allies and vassals from across his empire, an army of tens of thousands, including over 3,000 chariots, the most powerful weapon of the age. But he did not rush to meet the Egyptians in open battle. Instead, he set a trap. Hittite scouts captured 2 Bedouin spies and sent them to Ramesses with a story. The Hittite army was far away, days to the north. Believing the tale, Ramesses marched confidently toward Kadesh with only his leading forces. By the time Egyptian scouts uncovered the truth, it was too late. The Hittite chariots thundered from hiding, charging straight at Ramesses' isolated division. The Hittite chariots smashed into the Egyptian camp like a storm. Horses screamed, soldiers scattered, and dust darkened the sky. The camp of the Ra division collapsed under the onslaught. Ramesses himself was nearly overwhelmed. Surrounded and desperate, the young pharaoh is said to have called upon his god Amun for strength. Then, with his personal guard and a handful of loyal charioteers, he rode into the fray. Egyptian records glorify this moment, describing Ramesses as a lion among men, scattering Hittites with divine fury. Whether exaggerated or not, his counterattack gave his men the courage to regroup. Just as the Egyptians were about to be crushed, fortune turned. The Ptah division arrived from the south, fresh and organized. Together with Ramesses' survivors, they pushed back the Hittite chariots, forcing them into retreat. The battle raged until evening. The Hittite army still held the city of Kadesh, but they had failed to destroy the Egyptians. Ramesses, too, claimed victory, boasting of his heroism in temple inscriptions that still stand today. In truth, the battle was no clear triumph for either side. It was a bloody stalemate, with heavy losses on both ends. The city of Kadesh remained under Hittite control, but Egypt's pride remained intact. Much of what we know about Kadesh comes from Egyptian records, written to glorify Rameses. They portray him as single-handedly saving his army, driving thousands of Hittites into the river and returning home a victorious hero. The Hittite version, preserved in fragments, tells a different story. From their perspective, Muwatalli II had held his ground, defended Kadesh, and humiliated the Egyptians by luring them into a trap. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Neither side won outright, and both claimed glory. The Battle of Kadesh stands as a symbol of the limits of power. Even with massive armies and mighty kings, neither empire could break the other. The cost of endless war was too high. In the years after Kadesh, diplomacy began to replace battle. The same kings who fought bitterly on the plains of Syria would later negotiate peace, culminating in the first recorded peace treaty in history. Thus, Kadesh was both an end and a beginning, the last great clash between Hittites and Egyptians, and the first step toward an era of uneasy cooperation. The Battle of Kadesh was remembered for centuries as the largest chariot battle the world had ever seen. It was a story of courage, cunning, and survival, a reminder that even the greatest kings were not invincible. Today, the walls of Egyptian temples still show Rameses charging his chariot, bow drawn, enemies scattering before him. In Hittite ruins, the clay tablets speak of treaties and oaths, the quiet aftermath of war. Between them lies the truth, a moment when two mighty civilizations tested each other, essayed strength, and discovered that even the greatest empires had limits. The plains of Kadesh are silent now, the fortress long gone. But in that silence echoes the thunder of hooves and the clash of bronze, a memory of the day when Egypt and Hatti met in battle, and neither could claim the crown. The dust of Kadesh had settled, but its echoes lingered for years. Both Egypt and the Hittite Empire had marched into Syria seeking dominance, and both had emerged battered, exhausted, and unsatisfied. The Battle of Kadesh was not a victory, but a costly stalemate. And from that uneasy balance of power came something extraordinary, the first known peace treaty in human history. After Kadesh, Rameses II returned to Egypt declaring triumph. His temples displayed heroic carvings, the pharaoh alone in his chariot, striking fear into his enemies. In Hatti, King Muwatalli II and his successors told their own story of strength and survival. But behind the propaganda lay a harsher reality. Neither empire could destroy the other. Both suffered losses of men, wealth, and resources. Syria remained contested, but endless war offered no solution. As decades passed, the need for stability grew. Trade routes had to be reopened, border towns secured, and the constant threat of battle silenced. And so, diplomacy began to replace the clash of armies. After the death of Muwatalli II, power shifted within the Hittite Empire. His brother, Hattusili III, seized the throne in a dramatic coup. Strong, shrewd, and ambitious, he knew that peace with Egypt was not weakness. It was survival. The Hittites faced pressures on multiple fronts. Enemies threatened them from the north. Famine struck their lands, and the empire needed allies, not endless conflict. For Hattusili, diplomacy was a weapon sharper than any sword. What followed was an extraordinary exchange of letters between two of the most powerful rulers of the Bronze Age. Hattusili III and Rameses II wrote to each other with a mix of formality and surprising warmth. The tone was not one of enemies, but of brothers. They addressed each other as equals, calling each other Great King and Brother, signaling respect between empires. The letters spoke of peace, friendship, and the desire for alliance. One letter even reveals a touch of humanity. When a famine struck the Hittite lands, Rameses sent shipments of grain from Egypt. In return, the Hittites offered loyalty and support. Around 1259 BCE, the peace was made official. A treaty was drafted, inscribed on silver tablets, and sealed with the names of both kings. Copies were made in both Hittite cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, a testament to the equality of the two powers. The treaty was remarkable for its detail. It included a pact of non-aggression. Neither side would attack the other's lands. A mutual defense agreement. If one was attacked, the other would come to their aid. Extradition of fugitives. Runaway criminals and political refugees would be returned, ensuring stability on both sides. A promise of brotherhood. The kings swore eternal friendship before their gods. This was not merely a truce but a carefully constructed alliance, one that recognized the futility of war and the power of cooperation. To strengthen the peace, diplomacy was woven into family ties. A daughter of the Hittite royal family was given in marriage to Ramesses II, joining the two dynasties together. In Egypt, this was unprecedented. Pharaohs rarely married foreign princesses. Yet Ramesses welcomed her into his court, giving her Egyptian titles and honoring her as a queen. Their union was not just symbolic but practical. It ensured loyalty between two once bitter enemies. The treaty between Egypt and Hatti stands as the earliest known international peace agreement. It was more than parchment and promises. It was a vision of a world where war was not the only path to power. Remarkably, the treaty lasted. For the rest of Ramesses' reign, Egypt and the Hittite Empire remained allies. Trade flourished, borders stabilized, and the two civilizations coexisted without major conflict. It was, in its way, a Bronze Age miracle. Today, the words of the treaty still survive. In Egypt, the hieroglyphic version was carved into the walls of the Temple of Karnak, visible for all to see. In Turkey, the Hittite version was found on clay tablets written in cuneiform. Perhaps the most extraordinary recognition of this ancient pact is found in the modern world. At the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, a replica of the treaty hangs on display, a reminder that nearly 3,300 years ago, two empires chose peace over destruction. The story of Kadesh and the peace that followed is a reminder of the limits of violence. Egypt and Hatti fought with all the might of their age, armies of tens of thousands, chariots by the thousands, kings who claimed divine favor. And yet, victory belonged to neither. Instead, history remembers them for what came after: the courage to end war, to sign a treaty, and to set a precedent that echoes across time. The pharaoh and the great king never met face to face, yet their words crossed deserts and rivers, binding them together in an agreement that outlasted their lifetimes. In that bond, we glimpse the first steps of diplomacy, the art of choosing peace, even in a world of war. And so, from the dust of battle rose something stronger than conquest, an alliance that would outlive the clash of chariots, carried forward in stone, clay, and memory. When we think of the Hittites, the mind drifts first to kings and battles, the thunder of chariots at Kadesh, the signing of the world's first peace treaty. Yet an empire is not made of rulers alone. Behind the stone walls of Hattusa, in the villages of Anatolia, and along the fertile valleys that fed the kingdom, lived the ordinary men and women who gave the empire its heartbeat. To understand the Hittite world, we must look not only at its palaces and treaties, but at its farms, its rituals, and its homes. This is the story of the people of Hatti. At its core, the Hittite Empire was an agrarian society. The rhythms of daily life were set by the seasons, not by the proclamations of kings. Farmers rose with the sun to tend fields of barley, wheat, and lentils. Shepherds guided flocks of sheep and goats across the hills, their bells echoing in the valleys. Agriculture was not merely survival, it was sacred. Hittite prayers often asked the gods for rain and fertility of the soil. Festivals were tied to the planting and harvest, with offerings of bread and beer laid before the temples. In times of famine, as we know from royal letters, the hardship could be devastating. Kings themselves wrote desperate pleas for grain from Egypt or neighboring lands. But in times of plenty, the granaries of Hattusa overflowed, sustaining not just the city, but the empire's armies. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, stood as a marvel of its age. Built upon rocky hills in central Anatolia, it was encircled by massive stone walls that twisted across the ridges for miles. Gates adorned with lions and sphinxes stood as guardians of the city. Inside, life was vibrant and diverse. Nobles, priests, merchants, and commoners all shared the bustling streets. Market stalls sold pottery, bronze tools, woven cloth, and jewelry. Foreign traders brought in tin, horses, and luxury items, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere in the heart of the empire. At the highest point stood the royal palace, a sprawling complex of halls and courtyards. Nearby rose the great temple, dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess, whose favor the entire kingdom depended upon. These were not just places of worship. They were the anchors of both politics and spirituality. Most Hittites lived not in palaces but in modest mud-brick houses. These homes, usually 1 or 2 stories, clustered around courtyards where families cooked, ate, and worked together. The hearth was the center of the home, providing warmth and a place to prepare bread. Families were patriarchal, yet women held notable respect in Hittite society compared to many others of the time. Queens, such as Puduhepa, wielded real power in court, often signing treaties alongside kings. In villages, women managed households, wove cloth, and participated in rituals. Children were cherished, and their births were celebrated with offerings to the gods. They were taught farming, crafts, or, if of noble birth, the skills of writing and governance. Tablets found in Hattusa show evidence of schools where scribes trained in cuneiform, copying out myths and legal codes. Religion permeated every corner of Hittite life. The Hittites were famously known as the people of 1,000 gods. Every city, village, and mountain had its own deity, adopted from older Anatolian, Mesopotamian, and Hurrian traditions. The storm god of Hatti and the sun goddess of Erinna were chief among them, worshipped as the divine parents of the land. Festivals in their honor could last weeks, with processions of priests, music, and offerings of bread, wine, and animals. Myths told of gods who quarreled, disappeared, and returned, mirroring the cycles of nature. The story of the vanished god Telepinu, whose anger caused famine, reveals how deeply the Hittites connected human fortune to divine moods. Priests held powerful roles, but kings themselves acted as high priests, leading rituals to ensure the god's favor. Without this spiritual connection, the Hittites believed their empire would crumble. What held the Hittite society together was not only faith, but also law. The Hittites created one of the most advanced legal codes of the Bronze Age. Unlike the brutal eye for an eye codes of some neighbors, Hittite law often emphasized compensation over punishment. For example, if a man injured another, he might pay with silver or livestock rather than face execution. Only in severe crimes, such as treason or witchcraft, did death sentences apply. This system reveals a practical, community-oriented approach. Justice was meant not only to punish but to restore balance within society. The Hittites were skilled artisans and innovators. They worked bronze and iron, crafting weapons, tools, and ornaments. Their mastery of iron, in particular, gave them a technological edge and later shaped world history as the Bronze Age yielded to the Iron Age. They were also great record keepers. Thousands of clay tablets have been uncovered from their archives. Letters, treaties, hymns, and even recipes. These tablets preserve not only political history, but the voices of everyday concerns, disputes over land, pleas for grain, contracts for marriage. Through them, we glimpse a society both sophisticated and deeply human. To walk through Hatti in its golden age would have been to see a land of contrasts. Mighty palaces beside humble homes, grand temples towering over crowded markets, festivals of divine splendor alongside the toil of plowing fields. It was an empire held together not only by kings and armies but by farmers, priests, scribes, and merchants. Each contributed to a civilization that, though eventually forgotten for centuries, once stood among the great powers of the ancient world. Today, when we read the surviving tablets or walk the ruins of Hattusa, we are reminded that history is not just about rulers and battles. It is also about the countless unnamed individuals who lived, worked, and dreamed within those walls. They baked bread in clay ovens, whispered prayers to the gods of their families, raised children under Anatolia's vast sky, and built a society strong enough to challenge Egypt itself. Though their names are lost, their lives were the foundation upon which the glory of Hatti was built. If the Hittite Empire could be described in a single phrase, it might well be the land of 1,000 gods. This was no mere poetic exaggeration. To the Hittites, every mountain, river, village, and city had its own divine protector. Theirs was a world in which the sacred and the earthly walked side by side, and the borders between human life and divine presence were thin and shifting. Unlike some of their neighbors, the Hittites did not impose one supreme god over all others. Instead, they wove together a tapestry of deities from every land they encountered. Anatolian, Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and even Syrian gods all found places within the Hittite pantheon. This inclusivity was both political and spiritual. When the Hittites conquered new cities, they often adopted the local gods rather than rejecting them. It was a gesture of respect, a way to bind diverse peoples under one empire. A newly conquered town might keep its temple and rituals, simply adding them to the empire's ever-growing religious calendar. Among the 1,000, a few stood above the rest. The storm god of Hatti, master of thunder and rain, was the protector of the king and kingdom. He was depicted as a strong warrior standing upon mountains, wielding a thunderbolt. His power controlled the rains that nourished crops and, by extension, the survival of the people. Beside him stood the sun goddess of Erinna, radiant and majestic, seen as both mother and queen among the gods. She embodied light, warmth, and justice. In prayers and treaties, the Hittites invoked her as a divine witness to human promises. Together, these two formed the spiritual pillars of the empire, worshipped in great temples and honored in festivals that could last for weeks. The myths of the Hittites reveal much about their worldview. Unlike the orderly pantheons of Egypt or Greece, Hittite mythology often told stories of gods who vanished, became angry, or were forgotten, only to return after long trials. The most famous was the tale of Telepinu, the god of fertility and agriculture. In the myth, Telepinu vanished in anger, causing crops to wither and animals to stop bearing young. The land plunged into famine, and even the gods grew weak. Only after great effort, through prayers, rituals, and the intervention of a humble bee sent to sting him awake, did Telepinu return, restoring life to the world. Such stories reflected the Hittites' close connection to the rhythms of nature. Famine, drought, and uncertainty were not abstract threats, they were lived experiences. Myths offered explanations and rituals offered hope. In Hittite society, the king was not only a political leader but also the high priest of the realm. He was responsible for maintaining harmony between the gods and the people. If a plague struck or crops failed, it was the king who bore the blame for failing in his sacred duties. Royal archives preserve prayers written by kings themselves, pleading with the gods to forgive unknown sins. Sometimes these texts read less like commands and more like desperate confessions, as though the ruler of an empire were kneeling in humility before powers far greater than himself. The Hittite religious calendar was packed with festivals, seasonal rituals, harvest celebrations, and ceremonies tied to local traditions. Some festivals lasted over a month, involving processions, music, dancing, and feasts. Priests offered bread, wine, honey, and animals at temple altars. Musicians played lyres and drums while dancers performed sacred movements meant to please the gods. Processions carried divine statues from one temple to another, reaffirming the god's presence among the people. One of the most important was the Spring Festival, which sought to renew the fertility of the land after winter. It echoed the myth of Telepinu, symbolizing death and rebirth, disappearance and return. The temples of the Hittites were not always grand monuments like those of Egypt. Many were modest, built of stone and mud brick, with inner sanctuaries where priests tended to statues of the gods. Yet some sites stood out. At Yazilikaya, near Hattusa, the Hittites carved a sacred sanctuary directly into the rock. There, rows of deities are depicted in relief, striding toward one another in eternal procession. The storm god and sun goddess stand at the center, uniting the pantheon. This sanctuary was more than a temple. It was a cosmic stage, a place where heaven and earth met. Even today, the carvings seem alive, as though the thousand gods are still gathering in silent assembly. Religion was not confined to temples. Everyday life brimmed with rituals, charms, and omens. Hittite households kept small figurines of gods, prayed before meals, and performed simple sacrifices. Magic and religion overlapped freely. If someone fell ill, priests might perform a ritual transferring the sickness into a figurine, which was then cast into water or fire. To ward off evil, amulets were worn, and to secure love or fertility, incantations were spoken under the stars. Far from superstition alone, these acts gave ordinary people a sense of control in a world filled with uncertainty. In the end, the thousand gods were not a weakness, but a strength. They provided a spiritual language that allowed the Hittite Empire to rule over a patchwork of peoples and cultures. Whereas a single god might divide, 1,000 gods could include. Every city could see its own traditions reflected in the broader empire. This inclusivity helped bind the Hittites together at their height. When Hattusa fell and the Hittite Empire vanished from history, their gods seemed to vanish too. For centuries, no one remembered the storm god of Hatti or the sun goddess of Erinna. Their names lay buried in clay tablets, their images hidden in crumbling sanctuaries. Yet when archaeologists uncovered their temples and deciphered their tablets, the thousand gods spoke again. They remind us today that the Hittites were not only warriors and lawmakers but also dreamers and believers, weaving meaning into a world both harsh and beautiful. The Hittite gods, though forgotten for millennia, left a legacy of tolerance and syncretism. They showed that power could be shared, that unity did not require uniformity. In their pantheon, diversity was not a problem but a principle. And perhaps that is why, in the heart of Anatolia, surrounded by mountains and storms, the people of Hatti could build an empire that once stood alongside Egypt and Babylon. When we think of empires long gone, it is often their wars, their kings, and their ruins that capture our imagination. Yet the true measure of a civilization often lies not in what it conquered, but in what it created. For the Hittites, their greatest legacy was not only their chariots or fortresses, but their law, their diplomacy, and their vision of how societies might be bound together through rules rather than force. Long before the modern idea of justice took form, the Hittites developed a body of laws that revealed both their practicality and their humanity. Preserved on clay tablets, these laws covered matters ranging from theft and property disputes to marriage, slavery, and personal injury. What strikes historians is their tone. Unlike the harsh eye for an eye punishments of Babylon's famous Hammurabi Code, Hittite laws leaned toward restitution rather than revenge. For example, if someone injured another person, they might owe compensation in silver or livestock rather than face mutilation. If an ox damaged a neighbor's field, the owner was required to pay for the loss rather than endure a beating. Even serious crimes, unless treason or rebellion, often resulted in fines instead of execution. This suggests a society less interested in terrorizing its people and more focused on preserving balance. The Hittites recognized that stability came from fairness, at least as they defined it within their world. Another remarkable aspect of Hittite law was its treatment of vulnerable groups. For instance, their laws regulated slavery but also offered protections unusual for the time. A slave could marry, own property, and in some cases even buy their own freedom. There were laws against mistreating animals and even rules that addressed magical practices, showing that the state cared not only for the body but also for the unseen fears of the mind. While these laws did not create equality in the modern sense, they reveal a culture grappling with the challenges of human coexistence. Compassion, pragmatism, and order shaped their vision of justice. If law was their gift to the people within their empire, diplomacy was their gift to the world beyond it. The Hittites were among the first to master the art of the treaty, formal, written agreements between states that set rules for peace, alliance, or subordination. These treaties were often sealed with oaths to the gods, making them not only political but sacred contracts. The most famous of these was the Treaty of Kadesh, signed in the 13th century BCE between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II. This was the world's first known written peace treaty. Its terms called for mutual recognition of borders, an alliance in case either side was attacked by a third power, the return of fugitives between the two kingdoms, divine witnesses to the agreement, invoking both Egyptian and Hittite gods. A copy of this treaty still hangs today on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York, a symbol that even 3,000 years ago, people understood the value of peace through dialogue. The Hittites' reliance on diplomacy was no accident. Nestled in the crossroads of Anatolia, surrounded by powerful neighbors, Egypt to the south, Assyria to the east, Mycenaeans to the west, they could not rely on war alone. Treaties allowed them to weave a web of alliances, turning rivals into partners and enemies into trading partners. For the Hittites, survival depended on more than military might. It required words carefully chosen, oaths carefully sworn, and trust carefully built. None of this would have been possible without writing. The Hittites were the first Indo-European people to adopt cuneiform writing, borrowing it from Mesopotamia and adapting it for their own purposes. On clay tablets, they recorded not only treaties and laws but also myths, prayers, and royal annals. Thousands of these tablets have survived, unearthed from the ruins of Hattusa, giving us direct insight into their world. What makes the Hittite archives extraordinary is their breadth. They contain not only Hittite texts but also translations of foreign ones, Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, preserved as if the Hittites were curators of the world's knowledge. In this way, their capital became a library of the ancient Near East, a place where cultures met not only in battle but also in words. The Hittites also left their mark through technology. Their early mastery of ironworking gave them tools and weapons that were stronger than bronze. While it would take centuries before iron spread widely, the Hittites were among its pioneers, shaping the future of metallurgy. Their engineers designed sophisticated fortifications with sloping walls and gates arranged like mazes, frustrating invaders. Their architects carved sacred sanctuaries directly into the rock, blending human creativity with the natural world. Even in agriculture and animal husbandry, the Hittites displayed ingenuity, developing systems that sustained their empire in the rugged Anatolian highlands. When we piece these achievements together, their laws, treaties, archives, and technologies, a portrait emerges of a civilization that sought balance. The Hittites were warriors, yes, but also lawmakers. They were conquerors, but also diplomats. They fought with iron and chariots, yet also with pens and promises. Their greatness lay not in choosing one path but in holding many at once. Though their empire collapsed more than 3,000 years ago, the Hittites' influence has never fully disappeared. Every time a court favors compensation over vengeance, we hear an echo of their laws. Every time nations gather to sign treaties in hopes of avoiding war, we stand in the shadow of Kadesh. Their story reminds us that even in an age of empires, the pursuit of justice and peace was not an impossible dream, but a guiding principle. It is fitting that we speak of these legacies now, for in the episodes to come, we will witness the decline of the Hittite Empire. Storms, both natural and human, will batter their kingdom, and their 1,000 gods will fall silent. But before the silence came, the gift, a vision of law, diplomacy, and balance that remains one of humanity's earliest attempts to shape order out of chaos. Empires, no matter how mighty, carry within them the seeds of their own fragility. The Hittite Empire, once a titan of the ancient world, would not escape this truth. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, its lands trembled under forces that no king, no chariot army, and no treaty could withstand. Historians call this time the Bronze Age collapse, an age when civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean crumbled like clay in a storm. Among the victims of this collapse was the Empire of the Hittites. At first glance, there seemed little reason to predict disaster. The Hittites controlled vast lands, stretching from the Anatolian plateau to northern Syria. Their kings had made peace with Egypt, subdued rebellious vassals, and overseen trade routes that carried tin, copper, and grain. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Empires are like living organisms. They can grow, but they can also strain under their own weight. For the Hittites, the burdens were mounting. Endless wars drained their resources. Droughts weakened their harvests. Rival powers, once held at bay, grew stronger, and all the while restless movements of unknown peoples stirred along the coasts and islands of the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence and written tablets from Hattusa speak of famine during the final decades of the empire. Drought may have struck the Anatolian highlands, reducing grain yields. Letters describe pleas for shipments of barley and wheat as kings begged their allies for food. Even the mighty Ramses III of Egypt recorded sending grain to the Hittites during these desperate years. Such relief, though generous, was not enough to sustain a people already pressed by war and rebellion. Hunger gnawed at the empire from within, weakening loyalty and fueling unrest. While famine weakened them internally, external threats pressed from every side. To the east, the Assyrians were rising in strength, eager to expand their reach into northern Mesopotamia. To the west, rival Mycenaean Greeks traded, and sometimes raided, across the Aegean. But the greatest danger came from a mysterious force remembered in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples. These were waves of migrants and raiders, perhaps displaced by climate change or wars elsewhere, who swept across the Mediterranean in fleets of ships. They attacked coastal cities, burned ports, and toppled long-standing kingdoms. For the Hittites, whose southern territories depended on access to the sea for trade and supplies, the arrival of the Sea Peoples was catastrophic. Cities that linked the empire to Mediterranean commerce were destroyed, cutting off vital lifelines. As external enemies attacked, vassal states and subject peoples saw their chance to break free. The empire had always been a patchwork of ethnic groups, Luwians, Hurrians, Syrians, tied together by treaties and force. When the central power weakened, loyalty frayed. Some turned to Assyria for protection. Others aligned with the Sea Peoples. The unity of the empire dissolved into fragments. The Hittite king, likely Suppiluliuma Tlutzegu, the last known ruler, struggled to hold the pieces together. Inscriptions suggest he fought naval battles against the Sea Peoples, a rare glimpse of Hittite warships on the Mediterranean. But these efforts came too late. At last, the storm reached the heartland. Sometime around 1200 BCE, the great capital of Hattusa was abandoned and burned. Whether by invaders, rebels, or its own desperate people, we may never know. Archaeologists uncovered layers of ash across the ruins, signs of sudden destruction. The massive city gates, once proud symbols of imperial might, fell silent. The 1,000 gods of Hatti, once invoked with daily rituals, had no temple left to hear their prayers. When Hattusa burned, so too did the archives. Thousands of clay tablets survived by accident, buried beneath collapsed buildings. These would one day reveal the voices of the Hittites, but at the time, their world ended in flame. What is perhaps most haunting about the collapse is its finality. Unlike Egypt, which endured invasions and famine yet remained a kingdom, the Hittite Empire vanished. Its lands fractured into smaller states, known today as the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, small city-states scattered across northern Syria and southern Anatolia. These remnants carried on fragments of Hittite culture, but the unity, the power, the empire, it was gone. For centuries afterward, the very memory of the Hittites faded. Neighboring peoples spoke little of them. Their ruins lay buried, their writing unread. For the ancient world, the Hittites had simply disappeared. The Hittites were not alone in their downfall. Across the eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms and cities fell. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece, the city of Ugarit in Syria. Even the mighty Egyptians suffered terrible blows. Historians now see this as part of a wider crisis, the collapse of the Bronze Age system itself. Climate change, migration, war, and economic breakdown combined to unravel centuries of interconnected civilizations. The Hittites, at the crossroads of this fragile network, were among the greatest casualties. The story of the Hittite collapse is not only a tragedy of the past, but a lesson for every age. No empire, no matter how advanced its laws or mighty its armies, is immune to forces beyond its control. Drought, famine, migration, and war can overturn the proudest capitals. The Hittites remind us that human civilization is both powerful and fragile. It can build laws that last millennia, but it can also vanish in a single generation. And so the Hittite Empire passed into silence. Its fall was so complete that when Greek historians later wrote of the ancient world, they did not even remember the name of the Hittites. Only their ruins remained, buried beneath centuries of earth and forest, waiting for rediscovery. The empire that once signed the first peace treaty in history, that built cities of stone and wrote in clay, became a ghost, lost in the echoes of time. When Hattusa fell and the Hittite Empire crumbled, it was as if an entire civilization stepped out of history and into silence. Unlike Egypt, which maintained continuity even through invasions, or Mesopotamia, where city-states rose and fell yet carried on the written traditions of their forebears, the Hittites simply disappeared from the collective memory of the ancient world. For more than 2,000 years, their name would not be spoken. They became ghosts, present in scattered ruins, faint in the traditions of successor states, but absent from the chronicles of the great powers that followed. To later generations, it was as though they had never existed at all. The most striking aspect of the Hittites' disappearance is the loss of their name. In their own language, they called themselves the people of Hatti. Yet after the empire's fall, that name lingered only in fragments. The Neo-Hittite city-states in Syria and Anatolia carried forward pieces of their art and religious symbols, but their inscriptions shifted into Aramaic, Luwian hieroglyphs, and eventually the tongues of conquering empires. Assyrian records mention some of these successor states, but not the empire as a whole. To the Assyrians, the Hittites were just one more group of minor powers on their expanding frontier. In the Babylonian and Greek traditions, their memory was absent entirely. Unlike the Egyptians, who could boast of ancient kings even into the Roman era, the Hittites vanished from story and song. For several centuries after the collapse, fragments of Hittite culture survived in what are now parts of Turkey and Syria. Cities like Carchemish, Melid, and Kumu carried on Hittite traditions, blending them with local languages and influences from Assyria and Aram. Kings in these small states carved inscriptions in Luwian hieroglyphs, showing that some memory of Hittite writing persisted. But these city-states were never united, and they lacked the power of the old empire. They became stepping stones in the expansion of Assyria, which absorbed them one by one. By the 8th century BCE, the last Neo-Hittite states had fallen. It is telling that when these cities were swallowed by larger empires, the memory of their Hittite heritage faded too. Their gods, once worshipped by mighty kings of Hattusa, became local deities with forgotten origins. Their art and architecture were reinterpreted as Assyrian or Aramaean. What had once been the heart of a great civilization became only a background detail in someone else's story. When classical Greece rose centuries later, its poets and historians told tales of the ancient world: the Trojans, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Assyrians. Yet of the Hittites they said nothing. To Homer, writing in the 8th century BCE, the Hittite Empire might as well never have existed, though its kings had once faced Mycenaean envoys in treaty negotiations. Even the Romans, who prided themselves on cataloging the history of nations, overlooked the Hittites entirely. By then, their ruins lay buried, their inscriptions unreadable, their culture erased from living memory. This silence is one of history's greatest vanishings. A people who had signed the world's first known peace treaty, who had dominated an empire rivaling Egypt, were utterly forgotten within just a few generations. And yet faint echoes may have survived in myth. Some scholars suggest that the stories of the Bible, particularly in references to the Hittites as a people in Canaan, are distorted memories of contact with the Neo-Hittite states. In the Old Testament, Hittites are mentioned as one among many tribes inhabiting the land, though the biblical writers likely had no awareness of the vanished Anatolian Empire. Other scholars see hints of Hittite influence in Greek myth, especially in stories of gods who resemble deities once worshipped in Anatolia. Zeus's battles with monstrous foes, for example, recall earlier Hittite myths of the storm god Teshub. These similarities suggest that while the name of the Hittites vanished, fragments of their culture slipped quietly into the traditions of their neighbors. But these were only fragments, whispers rather than remembrance. In the centuries that followed, travelers in Anatolia occasionally stumbled upon strange ruins: massive stone walls, reliefs carved into cliffs, monuments bearing mysterious hieroglyphs. These stood as silent witnesses to a lost civilization. But without knowledge of who had built them, people attributed them to giants, gods, or other ancient peoples known from tradition. By the Middle Ages, these ruins became local legends. Villagers told stories about stone lions guarding forgotten cities, about ancient kings whose names no one remembered. The builders of Hattusa and Carchemish had vanished so thoroughly that their achievements became anonymous. The disappearance of the Hittites raises a haunting question. How does an entire civilization vanish from history? The answer lies in the fragility of memory. Writing can preserve voices, but only if later generations can read the script. Traditions can carry stories, but only if people keep telling them. When cities are destroyed, archives burned, and successor states absorbed, the past can be swallowed whole. For the Hittites, the collapse of their empire combined with the rise of new languages and powers severed the thread of memory. Without storytellers to carry their name, they became invisible to the ages. For more than 2 millennia, the Hittites remained in this silence. While Egypt, Babylon, and Greece stood proudly in the records of history, the Hittites existed only as ruins without context. No one could read their cuneiform tablets. No one knew their language. They were erased from the story of civilization. It would not be until the 19th century, when curious travelers and archaeologists began exploring Anatolia, that the silence would break. Even then, it took decades before the world realized that these ruins belonged to a forgotten empire, one that had once rivaled Egypt itself. But that rediscovery belongs to another chapter. For now, we must leave the Hittites in their long twilight, a people forgotten by all, waiting for the modern world to hear their voices again. For more than 2,000 years, the Hittites remained silent. Their cities lay in ruins, their writing undeciphered, their name absent from the histories of Greece and Rome. But the earth does not forget, even when people do. Beneath the hills of central Anatolia, buried in layers of soil and stone, the voices of a lost empire waited. The rediscovery of the Hittites in the 19th and 20th centuries is one of archaeology's great detective stories. It is a tale of travelers stumbling upon strange ruins, scholars puzzling over mysterious inscriptions, and the gradual realization that the world had forgotten an entire civilization, one that once rivaled Egypt itself. The story begins in the 19th century, when European explorers inspired by the Oriental Renaissance traveled through the Middle East in search of ancient wonders. In 1834, a French explorer named Charles Texier reached central Anatolia. There, in a remote valley near the modern Turkish village of Boğazköy, he stumbled upon massive ruins, stone gates flanked by lions, walls stretching across the hills, and strange carvings unlike anything he had seen in Greece or Rome. Texier was astonished. He believed he had found the ancient city of Tyria mentioned by Herodotus, but he could not explain the scale of the ruins or the mysterious hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone. His discovery sparked curiosity, but also confusion. No one could yet place these ruins in the known history of the ancient world. In the decades that followed, more travelers reported seeing odd hieroglyphs carved into rocks in Anatolia and Syria. These symbols were unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, but equally enigmatic. They appeared on city gates, on stelae, and in temples, often accompanied by reliefs of kings and gods. Scholars called them Hittite hieroglyphs, though at the time no one really knew who the Hittites were. The name came from the Bible. The Old Testament mentioned the Hittites as a people living in Canaan. Some scholars assumed that the mysterious ruins in Anatolia must belong to those biblical Hittites. It was a guess, but the label stuck. Only later would archaeologists realize that the biblical Hittites were not the same as the great Anatolian Empire, though the name conveniently bridged the gap. The true breakthrough came in 1906, when German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began excavating at Boğazköy, the site Charles Texier had first described. Winkler was searching for the capital of the ancient kingdom of the Hatti, which Assyrian records mentioned. What he uncovered was astonishing. Thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform. These tablets, buried in the ruins of palaces and temples, were written not in Sumerian or Akkadian, the known languages of Mesopotamia, but in an unknown tongue. Here was a vast archive belonging to a people no one could yet identify. Winkler suspected he had found something extraordinary. As excavation continued, it became clear. This was Hattusa, capital of a forgotten empire. The sheer scale of the archives, treaties, laws, letters, prayers, showed that this was no minor state. This was a world power, one whose name had vanished but whose records had survived. Finding the tablets was one thing, reading them was another. Scholars puzzled for years over the strange language inscribed in cuneiform. It looked Indo-European, sharing similarities with Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. In 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný made the breakthrough. Studying the tablets, he identified words that matched patterns in Indo-European languages. For example, the Hittite word watar clearly meant water, echoing English, German, Wasser, and Sanskrit, udan. From that key, Hrozný began unlocking the language. Suddenly, the voices of the Hittites could be heard again. Their laws, their prayers, their treaties, all of it became accessible. It was as if a civilization had risen from the grave to speak once more. As translations poured in, the scale of the discovery became clear. The Hittites were not a minor tribe mentioned in passing in the Bible. They had ruled a vast empire stretching across Anatolia and into Syria. They had fought Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh and signed the world's first known peace treaty. They had corresponded as equals with pharaohs and kings of Babylon. What astonished scholars most was how thoroughly this empire had been forgotten. Civilizations that had seemed central, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, had overshadowed the Hittites entirely. And yet here they were, hidden in the soil, waiting for modern science to uncover them. By the mid-20th century, the Hittites were firmly established in the narrative of world history. Excavations at Hattusa continued. revealing temples, fortifications, royal residences, and thousands more tablets. Scholars traced the outlines of their empire, reconstructed their myths, and compared their gods with those of Greece and the Near East. The rediscovery of the Hittites was more than just an academic triumph. It was a reminder of history, its fragility. A civilization could rise, thrive, and dominate, only to vanish so completely that it took 2 millennia for anyone to remember it. Today, the ruins of Hattusa stand as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors walk through the Lion Gate, gaze upon the great temple, and imagine the bustling capital that once ruled an empire. Museums in Ankara, Istanbul, and Berlin display tablets, statues, and reliefs, each piece a voice recovered from silence. The Hittites no longer belong to oblivion. They stand once again among the great civilizations of the ancient world. And yet their rediscovery also carries a humbling lesson. History is not fixed. What we think we know can be incomplete, and what we forget may someday return. Beneath our feet, beneath the soil of forgotten valleys, there may still be stories waiting to rise. From the emergence of a people in the highlands of Anatolia, to their rise as an empire, to their sudden disappearance, and at last their rediscovery, this is the story of the Hittites. Once lost, now remembered, they remind us that civilizations are fragile, but memory can be restored. In their own time, the Hittites called themselves the people of 1,000 gods. Perhaps it is fitting that their legacy, once scattered and silenced, has returned 1,000-fold, through books, museums, and the voices of scholars, so that they may never be forgotten again. The Hittites rose from obscurity, ruled as one of the great powers of their age, and then vanished into mystery. For centuries, their name was forgotten, their cities buried, their language silenced. Yet today, we can walk through the gates of Hattusa, read their treaties, and hear their prayers. Their story reminds us of the fragility of civilizations and of the way history can sleep, waiting for us to awaken it again. This is the legacy of the Hittites, once lost, now remembered forever.